Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is the acting director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Will Pomeranz joins us to discuss the latest on the situation between Ukraine and Russia. Will, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So, Will, I should say, at the hour that we're recording this discussion, Russia has not launched an invasion. We don't know what will happen. Everybody is sitting on pins and needles. But I thought, independent of what might happen between when you and I speak and when we share this with the world, what I thought I would ask you about is providing some context to the situation rather than speculating on if they will or if they won't. So how did we get to this moment in history, and how far back in history between Russia and Ukraine do we have to go to identify what would be a starting point?
Well, I'm a historian by training, so we can go back several centuries if we wanted to Catherine the Great and her language policies, or Alexander the Second and Third and their Russification policies, because they were always directed against Ukraine and the Ukrainian language. So Russia has a long history of discriminating and putting down Ukrainian culture. And I think that has been brought to the fore over the last weeks, months, and years. I think if we wanted to go back just a few months, I would go back to Putin's historical analysis of Ukraine and its national identity, which he dismissed outright as saying that it didn't have a history. So clearly Putin doesn't really respect Ukraine and its borders. The other moment that I would go back in history is 30 years ago to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because at that time, a decision was made not to attack Ukraine in the aftermath of its declaration of independence, and to recognize Ukraine, and indeed to denuclearize Ukraine so as to ensure the security of that region. And I think with Putin's ultimatums and his disdain for Ukraine, I think he wants to rewrite the post-Cold War settlement. And that's another point in history that we can return to.
Will, is there any legitimacy to Putin's analysis about the character and nature of Ukraine? Does he have any backing from historians or others?
No, he doesn't. And especially in light of the last century and a half, Ukraine has a defined culture, a language. It has aspired to independence. It has been involved in various sorts of negotiations at times in history. It showed up at the Versailles agreements, the Versailles negotiations at the end of World War II. So Putin really doesn't have, a standing to say that Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist. It has been a long and difficult road towards independence, but his disdain for Ukrainian identity was palpable in this manifesto.
It raises the question then, why now? With this long history, why at this moment or in the last several weeks and months has Russia deployed all of these troops to the border and seemed to be preparing for something?
I think Putin thinks that this is the best time to right a wrong that allowed Ukraine to get out of Russia's orbit. And Ukraine got out of Russia's sphere of influence at the end of the Soviet Union, and also in 2014, when it had the Maidan Revolution and basically said that it didn't want to be a part of the Eurasian Economic Union and wanted closer economic ties and political ties with Europe. So that is the source of Putin's displeasure. I think now is because it's the best time for Putin to address this question. The question of Ukrainian independence. Ukraine has various elements of instability. It has an inexperienced leader. Putin, on the other hand, has re-emphasized central control. He has a $600 billion slush fund for a rainy day in case he launches this attack. He believes that the West is disunited, and that Europe would not necessarily go along with any sort of sanctions program. Now, whether he's mistaken or not, obviously we will find out if indeed he decides to attack. But I think he feels that that this is the best time from his perspective to address a wrong that he wants to correct.
There's a whole notion that in any acute circumstance or any chronic circumstance, it can't change until it reaches an acute stage. And some would argue that while there hasn't been a full-on invasion, that essentially there is an ongoing slow burning war. Shots have been fired, people are dying, ceasefires have been violated. How do you characterize the current standoff minus the threat and the fear of a full-blown war?
Well, Ukraine and Russia have been at war since 2014, essentially.
The annexation of Crimea.
Annexation of Crimea, the creation of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, the demand that these two enclaves essentially have a federal veto of any future Ukrainian legislation, and thousands of Ukrainians have died in this struggle. So the idea that somehow Ukraine and Russia are not at war, or we are anticipating a military action, belies the fact that these two countries have been in conflict for at least 6 or 7 years now.
Does Russia's professed security concerns, or do they have any legitimacy to them? In other words, the Russians' fears about NATO or about NATO expansion, are these really a threat to Russia? And I'm trying to be fair to the Russian perspective. Largely in the West, it's seen as if Putin, of course, is trying to manufacture concerns to justify military action against Ukraine. What is your take on that?
My take is that clearly NATO is a defensive alliance. It has not made any turn or made any statements about attacking the Russian Federation. There have been various mechanisms to deal with disputes as they arise, but the idea that somehow Ukraine is going to attack Russia, or that somehow that Ukraine is imminently going to join NATO. President Biden has said that that is not in the cards in the near future. Indeed, he said that Ukraine has to deal with the problem of corruption before it can actually join NATO. And that has been an ongoing 30-year struggle. And I don't anticipate that criteria will change in the coming years and maybe even decades.
Well, what do we know about popular support for Putin's worldview in Russia as it relates to Ukraine? And does it matter in his calculations?
I think it matters if he doesn't. I think Putin has imposed various sort of restrictions on the press, on foreign NGOs, on human rights organizations, so that there's not a strong debate, as it were, as to whether this is a good policy or a bad policy. And I think that Putin will just find out, how heroic the Russian population wants to be in 2022, and if that's different from the Soviet population of 1941, because I think it is.
Is there room for compromise? Can the Western alliance, can NATO, the United States and its allies, can they give in to any of Putin's demands, or are they things that are not negotiable?
Well, from Putin's perspective, they're not negotiable. And that is a problem, because if we want to give diplomacy a chance, then there has to be some sort of give and take. Putin has basically said, the West and NATO and Europe are not responding to his questions and concerns. So from Putin's perspective, I think he's kind of placed himself into a corner, as it were. He doesn't really have a lot of maneuverability to retreat. And so he has stuck with his demands and has continued to do so. And that I'm sure there are plenty of different diplomatic solutions that are being presented. But if Russia believes that the West just simply has to accede to its demands, then that is not going to work.
You know, I promised I wouldn't play the speculation game, the what if game, because it's certainly not what the Wilson Center tends to do. We leave that to pundits. But I do want to ask you just your thoughts on the what if there were an outbreak of full war, a full-blown invasion and a response from Ukraine and its allies. Could the Russian economy withstand the kind of sanctions that have been threatened?
Putin clearly believes that they can. And in the aftermath of several of Putin's adventures, most notably after the Crimea annexation in 2014, the West imposed severe sanctions, or what they thought was severe sanctions on Russia. But, you know, the price of oil goes up, the price of oil goes down. Russia was able to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Russia was able to add to its coffers in terms of this rainy day fund. I think Putin believes that the Russian people will suffer with him, or not with him, but will suffer because this is their strategic interest is in play. And so I think Putin believes he can survive sanctions. I think he believes that he can turn to China to a certain degree in order to get around sanctions or increase Russian trade. So I think Putin obviously believes he can get away with it. And I think he doesn't believe that the West is united so that they would impose the maximum sanctions regime. And there are various tea leaves out there that suggest that that might be true. I think the Europeans are very hesitant to kick Russia out of the SWIFT bank messaging system. And that's because the Europeans have the most to lose. They have significant trade relations with the Russian Federation, and the United States does not. So I think that Putin believes that he can exploit these divisions and somehow survive politically and maybe even get the results that he wants strategically.
What you describe, that this is a problem for the West with or without an invasion, right? The tension between the allies, destabilization of the West. And that's what some have said, that Putin's ultimate game is to keep the West on edge, keep the alliances unstable. What do you make of that analysis? Do you think there's validity to that Putin is playing a different kind of game that doesn't necessarily involve an invasion of Ukraine?
He may be, but I think Putin, in retrospect, will be surprised at the sense of unity between the allies. I don't think he thought that they could produce any sort of joint response. And Biden and the allies have held together so far. Whether that's true going forward, I don't know. But I think Putin, to a certain extent, did not expect such a full-throated reply to his threats against Ukraine.
Should we view Russia as an expansionist power, or is this aggression unique and specific to Ukraine?
Russia is an imperial power. The Soviet Union was an imperial power. The Tsarist regime was an imperial power. They always believed that they have an expansionist agenda and that they were destined to rule over vast lands. And so this imperial idea is something that is clearly pronounced in Putin and his rhetoric, that he has talked about, you know, not just he's not just talked about the victories of the Soviet Union, but he has identified with the imperial designs of the Soviet Union and the Tsarist Empire. And so I think Russia has always felt itself that it had a destiny not a manifest destiny, but a destiny to rule over the Eurasian continent. And Putin is a prime example of that aspiration.
Well, Will, thank you very much for your insights into both the history and the current circumstances. And of course, we'll be talking about this again because it's not over yet. And let's just hope for peaceful resolution one way or another.
I agree.
Thanks again. Our guest has been Will Pomeranz. And if you're interested in Will's work and the work of the Kennan Institute, just come to wilsoncenter.org, and they have terrific resources on this topic and a host of others. And we hope you'll also come back again for another edition of Wilson Center Now. And until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.